featuring epic brand new pop anthems and classic big band hits.
You won't admit you love me.
From me, British singer-songwriter Shane Hampshire.
Your side, let the rain fall down on me.
Search for Shane Hampshire's debut album, available to stream now.
Hey guys, I'm Christina Prudent, and this is Enchanted Ink. Welcome to the show. Every week, I choose a topic and start us off by pondering how insert folklore here could be so consistent all over the world before the benefit of trade and travel. Is it that the human brain, the human imagination, develops in a certain way regardless of outside factors? Like we all just come up with the same wild ideas no matter where we are in the world? Or could it be possible that certain ideas are embedded in our collective genetic memory? I've always kind of wondered about these possibilities, but especially now doing this show and researching the mythologies and legends of different cultures. It's truly remarkable and a bit scary. Because realistically, the implication here is that there has to have been some race of smaller humanoids living alongside us at some point that traditional history has forgotten. This week, we're looking at fairies and elves, and if you can't tell, I'm shook. The pragmatic part of my brain has an explanation for everything. But it's that other part that can't help but believe. You know, it's not like ancient humans were dumber than us. If they say tiny little people were running around and stealing stuff, then maybe tiny little people were running around stealing stuff. At this point, that wouldn't even be the weirdest thing I've heard this week. Fairy lore is truly extensive and fascinating. And I know I won't be able to get to all of it in this episode, but for today, we'll be focused on the reimagining of fairies in the world of Artemis Fowl by Eoin Colfer. First of all, before we really begin, I want to clarify some terminology between fairies, elves, and leprechauns, because I plan to touch on all three at some point. Well, there's just no way for me to say any of this without sounding like a super nerd, so I'm just going to go ahead and throw that out there and own it right here. I mean, this is what I talk about on the internet all day. No one is surprised. It's fine. So, the words fairy or fae or fairfolk refer to the entire race of supernatural beings characterized by human appearance, small stature, and magical powers. And when I say entire race, I mean that anything else by any other name that shares these characteristics will fall under the umbrella of fairy, meaning elves, pixies, leprechauns, goblins, gnomes. They're all just types of fairies. The differences come in when we start talking about their specific powers and physical attributes. So for this episode, in the context of Artemis Fowl, we'll be focused primarily on elves. Now, as we know, elves are not considered real from a scientific standpoint. However, I invite you to ask any random old lady born outside of the US, and they'll tell you what's real. As I said, stories and folklore about the Fae appear globally, all with consistent recurring motifs. The most consistent one being the idea that the Fae are tricksters, and the only way to ward them off or protect yourself against them is through the use of charms like church bells, iron, or wearing an item of clothing inside out. In Mexico and the Philippines, they believe in little gnome-like creatures called duendes. Specifically in Mexico, duendes are known as little people who live inside the walls of homes, especially in the bedroom walls of young children. Apparently, they attempt to clip the toenails of unkempt children, but often end up removing their entire toe by mistake. The Filipino version of duende live in caves, old trees, or attics and basements. But the overall idea is the same. They make mischief around the house or the area, causing things to go missing or not be where you left them. They don't seem particularly dangerous, but in some areas they believe that the duende hide or take small children, and the only way to prevent this is to appease them with an offering. But that is, again, a very common motif that you see in pretty much any elf or fairy lore. In West Africa, we see the fairy lore show up as stories of the Aziza. The Aziza are more aligned with your traditional concept of a fairy rather than an elf. Tiny, beautiful, benevolent nature spirits with insect wings. They're said to live in trees or anthills and offer spiritual knowledge to those who encounter them. Conversely, in South Africa, they have the legend of the abattoir. Tiny little hunters that travel around on the backs of ants and use poison darts to take down large animals and generally terrorize the neighboring Zulu tribe. So Zulu had to be careful in how they treated any abattoir they encountered, and there was one major point that they had to keep in mind. Abattoir hated being told or reminded that they were tiny. So the common thread between Aziza and the abattoir seems to be to watch where you step. And the reason really just depends on what motivates you more as a person. Either be careful because you don't want to hurt our happy little Aziza fairy friends, or watch where you put your feet because if you step on an abattoir, it will kill you. But I think the fairies we're all most familiar with are the European version, originating within the Welsh, Irish, and Scottish tradition. The Gaelic terms Aes She or Dina She, which I googled how to pronounce because they're spelled the Irish way with O's everywhere, are what they use to describe our friends, the fair folk. It directly translates to people of the mounds, since that's where they're commonly thought to live or at least be part of their territory. Mounds, or hills, particular forests, specific types of trees, or fairy rings. And actually, that's the perfect segue. Let's take a moment to talk about how not to get your life ruined by an elf or fairy. A fairy ring, or elf circle, is a naturally occurring phenomenon where mushrooms grow in a perfect circle, usually in forested areas or fields. It's a pretty cool sight to see under normal circumstances, but especially if you're superstitious, because typically the grass within the circle is either A, super green compared to the outside, or B, dead. So back around the Middle Ages, medieval times, where all the good lore comes from, the idea caught on that these circles are formed by fairies or elves dancing, and to disturb one or step into one had all kinds of consequences. The superstitions vary, but a common one is that anyone who steps into an empty fairy ring will die at a young age. Or simply that they'll come find you and hold you captive in the fairy realm for the rest of eternity. But as I mentioned earlier, fairies can be bamboozled using various charms. So if you ever find yourself trapped within a fairy circle, you can be rescued if someone outside the circle touches you with iron or throws herbs like marjoram and thyme into it. Both of those things will supposedly break the spell. So the moral of the story: do not disturb a fairy circle. And the same goes for fairy trees. They're usually hawthorn or ash growing in the middle of a field or by a road. Don't climb it. Don't tear it down. Apparently, there's just something about it. You'll know it when you see it, and you better leave it alone. Like I said, common rules of thumb to keep you safe from the trickery of mischievous fairies are weirdly universal. Number 1, carry iron. It neutralizes their power. Number 2, if you find yourself lost in the woods or walking in circles when you shouldn't be, and you suspect it's the work of fairies, take off an item of clothing and wear it inside out. It confuses them and allows you to escape their illusion. Number 3, if you're in the forest and you hear beautiful music or you see floating lights, do not follow them. Do not go towards it. Go in the opposite direction. Those are just the fairies trying to lure you into the shadow realm. Number 4, if you come across an item in the woods that shouldn't be there and doesn't belong to you, don't take it. Don't take it. Don't eat it. Don't touch it. And lastly, never mention that you have a baby or a younger baby sibling to a fairy, or they'll come into your house and steal the baby and leave a changeling in their place. Now, if you think you've somehow offended the fairies, your best bet is to leave out a saucer of butter or cream overnight to appease them. They may not take it, but they'll at least appreciate the offer. So those 5 rules should really have you covered for most kinds of fairies. Artemis Fowl knew all of these rules. He just thought he could handle them, but he was completely in over his head when it came to leprechauns. Published in 2001, the first book in the Artemis Fowl series, written by Eoin Colfer, follows the story of a 12-year-old Artemis Fowl, a millionaire, a genius, and above all, a criminal mastermind. But even Artemis doesn't know what he's taken on when he, with the help of his bodyguard Butler, kidnaps a fairy, Captain Holly Short of the Lower Elements Police Recon Unit. These aren't the fairies of bedtime stories. They're dangerous. Told in third person, Artemis Fowl switches between human and fairy characters to fully explore themes of conflict and greed. Full of unexpected twists and turns, it's a riveting, magical adventure that the author describes as Die Hard with fairies. And honestly, he's not wrong. Stay tuned to learn more about leprechauns after the break. If you haven't heard of Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free. Completely free. I love free. I'm sure you love free. So that should be motivation enough. But the cool thing about it is, it allows you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. And now, back to the show. All right, so before the break, we were discussing how not to get on the bad side of the fair folk and we landed squarely into leprechauns. Ancient Irish folklore describes leprechauns as little bearded old men wearing red suits who could often be found working on a shoe. The idea of what we think of, what everyone pictures, the green getup with the top hat and the four-leaf clover, was not introduced until the 18th century by a poet named William Allingham. Fun fact, female leprechauns don't exist. Leprechauns are said to be the unwanted or deformed children of fairies that have been abandoned by the rest of the community, which explains their grouchy, solitary, and untrusting nature. It almost makes sense that they were shoemakers, which was traditionally a male occupation. Now, the etymology, or the origin of the word leprechaun, is also a matter of some debate. Some believe that it's a direct translation of the Irish word lethregan, which literally means shoemaker. And so that seems like the obvious answer, but there's evidence in ancient Irish texts that they're believed to be incarnations of the Euro-Celtic god Luck, spelled L-U-G-H. So do you see the problem? Both of those theories feel like an appropriate fit. So it's unclear which one is correct or whether it's kind of a combination of both. Anyway, the last thing I want to note is that leprechauns are also notorious tricksters who enjoy playing practical jokes and will do anything to avoid being captured, because if you catch one, they have to grant you 3 wishes. Although because they're so tricky and malicious, it's said that your wishes will almost certainly backfire. Now, the author, Eoin Colfer, puts a truly interesting spin on all of this lore with Artemis Fowl. The books take place in Ireland and fairies do exist. They talk about pixies, dwarves, goblins, elves, and all types of other creatures, but no little men in green suits. The fairies live below ground in what they call the lower elements, and the fairy perspective of the story is told by Holly Short, a captain in the Lower Elements Police Reconnaissance Unit, or LEP Recon. Leprechaun, right? So we see what he did there. And so he really takes every part of Irish leprechaun lore and weaves it into the series in one way or another. For example, we know that traditionally leprechauns' worst case scenario is getting caught by a human because they have to grant them wishes and or give them their pot of gold as a bribe in exchange for their freedom. While in the book, recon officers don't have a personal pot of gold, but because the fairies wish to remain secret and separate from humans, there's a ransom fund in the event that one gets captured, and it's made up of 24-karat pure gold. Another key difference between real fairy lore and the world of Artemis Fowl is that they don't wield unlimited magic. In most stories, magic is just a part of the being. Like we said in the Blood and Bone episode about Ashe and Jedi midichlorians, right? If you're a magical creature, then magic just flows through your body. It's generated from within. But the lower elements fairies have to complete a ritual at an above-ground magical location during a full moon in order to replenish their magic before they run out. They say a prayer and bury an acorn at a magical landmark like Stonehenge, or in Holly's case, a fairy mound in Ireland, the land of their ancestors. Because as they say in the series, pretty much all of Ireland is magical. So it's primarily a plot device to explain how Holly gets caught and why she's unable to escape right away. But it also calls back to the idea that fairies are people of the earth, and everything that they are revolves around nature. If you analyze this from a sociological perspective, all of this folklore and mythology is designed to teach appropriate fear of the wild and respect for the world around you. It keeps kids out of the woods alone and teaches them not to wander too far from home. It keeps superstitious adults from destroying natural habitats. So, whether you truly believe in fairies or not is up to you, but it's worth it to respect their rules. You have nothing to lose and everything to gain. But I'll tell you one thing. I'll never disturb a fairy ring. And that's it. Thanks for tuning in. If you love fairies or have some other local fairy lore from your country and want to tell me about it, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and now YouTube at Enchanted Ink Podcast, and on Twitter at Enchanted Ink Pod. Follow, like, and subscribe to reach out to me and keep the conversation going. I want to hear from you. Or email me at our home on the web, enchantedinkpodcast.com. If you like the show and want to hear more, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, Google, or wherever you like to listen, and leave a review to let me know how I'm doing. Thanks, guys. See you next time.